Hello everyone. In this session, we are going to discuss the chapter named Defense. Now, when we talk about this chapter, first of all, let's understand this from the examination perspective and then we'll move on to the chapter. So, if you look at the past papers, you will see that not many questions come from here, and most of the questions that do come, they come in the prelims examination. So, this is one chapter which will primarily be important for your prelims examinations, but you cannot rule out a possibility of a question coming in the mains examination as well. Although we have not seen any question coming in the mains examination, at least in the past 7 to 9 years, but still there exists a possibility and they can anytime ask a question. So what kind of questions could be asked if at all they ask a question in the mains examination? We'll have a discussion on that as well. But most importantly, our focus will be on the prelims examination when we consider this chapter. So when we talk about defense, there are a lot of things that can be discussed here. So we will have to ensure that all the important areas from where the questions have been asked and all the areas from where the questions could be asked, all these areas are properly covered. And what else you will have to do apart from studying this chapter from here, we'll have a discussion on that as well. But first of all, when we talk about defense, why exactly do we need defense? Do we need to have so many missiles? Do we need to have so many aircrafts? Do we need to have so many fighter planes, so many submarines? Do we need to have such a huge amount of budget being allocated to defense of India? You try to think of this answer from a simple analogy, and this analogy comes from your body. When you talk about your body, you take vaccines. When you're very small, you take vaccines against polio, you take vaccines against diphtheria, there can be vaccines against many other diseases. The chances that you will get infected with these diseases are very low. You might not get infected with polio in your entire life, but there exists a possibility. Maybe 1% possibility, maybe 2% possibility, but there exists a possibility. And this is the reason why you take vaccines. So, vaccines is a way for you to defend your body against anything that could be a threat in future. So when we talk about missiles, when we talk about fighter jets, when we talk about tanks, so these are not some things that we need to be prepared with only when we are at war. But we need to be prepared for possibility of anything that might happen in future. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not this year, maybe not in 20 years, maybe in 50 years. But we need to be prepared for it. And that is the reason why we need defense. And that is also the reason why we need to ensure that our defense mechanism is of top-notch quality, which can match anyone in the world. Because if you just talk about India, let's take India into perspective. We have two neighbors from whom we haven't had a good relation for a while, right? You talk about China, you talk about Pakistan. These have been two countries ever since our independence. We have not had a very good running relationship all the time with these two countries. Apart from that, there are threats that can be posed by many other countries as well. You can talk about terrorism also here. So we need to be prepared for all these things. Not only this, if you talk about any kind of economic development or any kind of social development for a country, for that to happen also we need to be very sure that we are not concerned about defense. We are not concerned about our security, our integrity, our sovereignty. All these things need to be ensured if we want social development or economic development to happen in our country. So there are a lot of things that you might think of in case if you are wondering why do we need defense. So these are some of the important points. There are many other reasons why we need to have defense, but yes, these are prime points why we need to have defense. So this is it about why to have defense. Now when we talk about this chapter defense, what are our objectives? What are we going to learn? First of all, what we'll do is we'll have a conceptual understanding of all the missiles, because missiles have been one area from where a lot of questions have been asked. Apart from that, we'll have a look at all the aircrafts of India. We'll have a look at the Navy setup of India. And towards the end, we'll have a brief discussion on what is the meaning of radar, why do we need radars, how are radars being used, and then after that, we'll move to the last segment of our discussion, and this will be on stealth technology. Now, coming to this chapter of defense, what are our learning objectives? The first thing that we'll start with are missiles. And why missiles? if you look at the past papers, if you look at the science and technology questions that come, whenever defense related questions are coming, more than 60 to 70% of the questions have been from Indian missiles. So that's why a conceptual understanding of the missiles and all the missiles which are available with India. These are two topics which become very important for your examination. After that, we'll have a look at all the main battle tanks of India. For example, in June 2020, we saw that when there was a struggle going on between India and China in the Ladakh region in the Galwa Valley, one of the tanks of India, that is T-90 Bhishma, was in news. So we'll have a discussion on Indian tanks as well. After that, we'll have a discussion on Indian aircraft. Then we'll have a discussion on Indian Navy and all the things which are available with the Indian Navy. And then finally, we'll move towards two concepts, one being radar and the second concept being stealth. We'll have a discussion on these two topics towards the end of this discussion of this chapter. So this is what we are going to learn in this chapter. So the first thing that we need to start with are missiles. Now when we talk about missiles, I'm very sure that most of you are aware of. You might have seen it in the photographs, you might have seen the videos of it. You definitely know what a missile looks like, right? So, but when we talk about a missile, you'll normally see that a missile looks like this. So if we talk about the two parts of the missile that you have, and you go back to the discussion that we had in the space technology while we were discussing the launchers, we had a similar discussion. What we discussed there was that you have the payload here, right? Now in this case, when we talk about the missiles, this upper part is where you have the warhead. This part is called as the warhead. The warhead would carry the bombs, will carry anything that is required to destroy either the incoming missiles or destroy an enemy location. So this will be the warhead. And then this part again can be called as the launcher. If you remember, we talked about the stages when we were talking about the launchers of ISRO. So similarly, you have a launcher here. We talked about the stages, right? So similarly, you also have stages here. Although what was the case with PSLV and GSLV was that we had 3 stages or 4 stages, right? But in case of missiles, you will usually see that most of the missiles will either have 1 stage or maximum they will have 2 stages. There are only very limited number of missiles which have either 3 stages or 4 stages. Very rarely you will find that there is a missile that has 3 stages or 4 stages. Most of the missiles will have either 1 stage or only 2 stages. So this is what we normally see with the missiles, and this is a basic structure of how you see the missiles, although there are different variants of the missiles and we'll have a discussion on that, but this is what a missile looks like. So when we talk about the missiles, they are either used to intercept incoming objects such as missiles or aircrafts of the enemy, or they would be used to launch an offensive strike towards an enemy, right? So these are two ways in which we use the missiles, either as a defense or as an offensive. Both the ways missiles can be used. So it's not always to destroy an enemy target. Many a times it is also to defend ourselves against something which is incoming. It could be an aircraft, it could be a missile, it could be anything. It could be a satellite as well. So for example, if you remember 2019 March, if you go back to the newspapers, you will look at discussions related to Mission Shakti. So this is where we were able to successfully test an anti-satellite missile, a missile which will be able to destroy a satellite. So we'll have a discussion on Mission Shakti also towards the very end of the chapter. So all these kind of discussions keep on happening, and that's why these kind of news articles become important from your examination perspective as well. So anyway, coming back to the missile, first thing that we need to look into are the classification of missiles. When we talk about the classification of missiles, there are many ways in which classification can be done, and all these classifications from your prelims perspective also becomes very important. So the very first thing that you look at on your screens is on the basis of range. So when we talk about on the basis of range, they can either be a short range missile, or they can be a medium range missile, or they can be a long range missile. Not only this, there is another category which is called as intercontinental missiles. So depending upon how far they can go, what is the range of the missile, this is the first way in which we classify the missiles. Now even the meaning of short range missiles also changes according to what kind of missile we are talking about. Another classification that we'll have a look upon. So, for example, when we talk about the starting and the end point. So, depending on the starting and the end point, you can either talk about a surface to surface missile, a surface to air missile, air to air missile, air to surface missile. All these are possibilities, right? Even there are missiles which can be launched from a submarine. So that will be another category of missile. So depending on the starting point and the end point, another way in which we can classify the missiles could be seen here. Now the next way to classify the missiles are on the basis of path or trajectory. And this perhaps is the most important classification. You have two here, one which is called as a ballistic missile and the second which is called as a cruise missile. So if you look at these two pictures, so on the left hand side, the picture that you see is of a ballistic missile, and on the right hand side, what you look at is a cruise missile. Now, there are basic differences between the two missiles. We are talking on the basis of trajectory. So when we talk about a ballistic missile is a kind of missile which will take a normal parabolic path. It is something that will take a normal parabolic path. What is the meaning of a parabolic path? You just imagine throwing a stone, or if you have a ball in your hand, just throwing a ball. So what exactly happens? If you throw a ball or a stone, it will just go like this in air and it will just go and drop somewhere, right? This is a shape which is called as a parabola. So something similar is a path that will be taken by a ballistic missile. When we talk about a cruise missile, the second picture that you see, cruise missile is where this will not take a normal parabolic path, but we can maneuver how we want this missile to move. It can move like an aircraft. So for example, if you look at the picture, what you will see is that it has wings, just like an aircraft would have. Why? So that we can manage it while it is in the air. But when it comes to a ballistic missile, we do not manage it after it has been launched. We do not manage it in the air, and it is not possible for us to maneuver a ballistic missile just like an aircraft. So this comes as a primary difference. That is the main reason why you will see that there are wings on a cruise missile, but there are no wings on a ballistic missile. The ballistic missile picture that you see on the screen is of an Agni missile, Agni 5 to be exact. So this is ballistic missile. Now there comes a lot of differences between a ballistic missile and a cruise missile on this basis. So for example, when we talk about a ballistic missile, since we are talking about it taking a trajectory and it's just like throwing a ball or throwing a stone, what will happen is that it can take a longer path. So this becomes the reason why you will see that the ballistic missiles can take a very long path as compared to the cruise missiles. For example, a ballistic missile will go up to 1000 kilometers, sometimes 5000 kilometers. We are developing Agni 6 missiles where we'll be able to go up to maybe 10,000 to 12,000 kilometers. So the ballistic missiles will be able to take a very long distance because of this very reason that it takes a parabolic path and we don't want to maneuver the path once it has been launched. Now, as compared to this, when we talk about the cruise missiles, in case of cruise missiles, you will see that normally the cruise missiles will go for 100 kilometers, 300, 500 kilometers. The long range missiles will go up to maybe 1000 kilometers. So there's a difference between how much distance can be covered by a ballistic missile and how much distance can be covered by a cruise missile. So that's why if you go back to the first classification that we did, we talked about short range missile, medium range missile, long range missile and intercontinental missile. So when we say short range missile for a ballistic missile perhaps will be 100 kilometers, maybe 300 kilometers, 500 kilometers. But when we say short range missile for a cruise missile, it might be just 40 kilometers, 50 kilometers, 70 kilometers. And if we say 400 to 500 kilometers for a cruise missile, we might say that it is a long range cruise missile. So this is a difference that comes here. Short range missile for a ballistic missile will perhaps be a long range missile for a cruise missile. So that's not an exact definition. So what you will see is whenever we use the terms short range or medium range or long range, you will see that it is used with ballistic or used with cruise. That such and such missile is a short range ballistic missile or a short range cruise missile, because that will give you a hint that if the phrase that has been used is a short range ballistic missile, perhaps it is 200 kilometers, 300 kilometers. But if the phrase says it's a short range cruise missile, then perhaps it is just 40 kilometers, 50, 70 kilometers. So there comes a difference. Similarly, when we say long range, again long range cruise missiles perhaps will be just 500, 700 kilometers. Long range ballistic missiles can be up to 4,000 to 5,000 kilometers. So this is another difference that we see. Then again, in terms of path, the ballistic missile takes a predefined parabolic path, but the path of a cruise missile can be changed, can be maneuvered. It will be just like an aircraft. Another difference that we see is where they fly. You will see that the ballistic missiles will go above the atmosphere, or at least at the higher ranges of the atmosphere, and then they will drop from there. But while we talk about the cruise missiles will be traveling at the very lower range of the atmosphere. So it will not go as high as the ballistic missiles. So this is another difference that we see. So these are some of the ways in which you can differentiate between what is a ballistic missile and what is a cruise missile. Another difference that comes between the ballistic and the cruise missile is the purpose for which they are used. For example, when we talk about a ballistic missile, the ballistic missile most of the times has strategic missiles. We'll just have a discussion on what is the meaning of a strategic missile. And most of the times when we talk about the cruise missile, you will see that cruise missiles are being used as tactical missiles. We'll just have a discussion of what is a strategic missile and what is a tactical missile. But as a point of difference between the two, you should know that most of the times the ballistic missiles will be used as strategic missiles, while when we talk about the cruise missiles, they will be used as tactical missiles. So these are some of the different points between the two kinds of missiles. I hope that this part is clear. So then comes the classification on the basis of utility. And when we talk about the classification on the basis of utility, there are two. One which is called as a strategic missile, and the second which is called as a tactical missile. So what is the difference between a strategic and a tactical missile? Now there are many missiles that we have which will be used during a battle in the war zone. These are the kinds of missiles which are normally called as tactical missiles. But there are other missiles which we just want us to have so that our enemies know that we have them. For example, a missile that can go as far as 4,000 or 5,000 kilometers. If a missile can go up to 4,000 or 5,000 kilometers and perhaps can carry a nuclear warhead apart from the normal chemical or maybe the biological warheads, then in that case you definitely know that whole of Pakistan and many parts of China also come inside the range. And when these countries also come inside the range, in a way we are just telling them that look, if you want to attack us, you can. If you want to launch an offensive against us, you can. But you should know that we have strategic missiles, and these missiles have something called as second strike capability. Even if we are attacked, even if many of our defense centers or launch pads are being destroyed, we'll still have strategic missiles at some points from where we can launch an offensive after we have been attacked. So when you have something like this, these are the roles which are played by strategic missiles. And that's why most of these strategic missiles will have something which is called as a second strike capacity or second strike capability. Just understand strategic missiles which we want to have, because if we are under attack or if we want to use it as a deterrent, then in that case it is called as a strategic missile. And then you have the second classification, which is of a tactical missile, which will be used during a war, which will be used in a battlefield. So that kind of missile will be called as a tactical missile. Now the difference that you will see normally between a strategic and a tactical missile is also that tactical missile will normally have a very short range because you are using it in a battlefield. But when you talk about strategic missiles, the strategic missiles will have very long ranges because we want to use these missiles as deterrent. So these are few differences, and again, as we just discussed when we were discussing the ballistic and the cruise missiles, strategic missiles normally will be ballistic missiles and the tactical missiles will normally be the cruise missiles. It's not a rule, but most of the times this is what will happen. So this is another way in which we classify the missiles. Now, apart from these four classifications that we have seen, there can be many other ways also to classify the missiles. For example, there could be on the way of propulsion, on the basis of propulsion, that whether we are using a solid propellant or a liquid propellant, a cryogenic propellant, on the basis of that there can be a classification. Not only this, there can be a classification on the basis of what kind of aerodynamic control we are providing, what kind of guidance we are providing, whether it is wing guided or tail guided. There are many ways in which we can classify the missiles, but those all classifications are not very important. The most important classifications are on the four areas that we have looked upon. What is the starting and the end point, what kind of trajectory it is taking, on the basis of the range of the missile, on the basis of the utility of the missile, on the basis of the start and the end points of the missile, and on the basis of the trajectory that is being taken by the missile. So these are the four major ways in which we classify the missiles. After that, there are others also, as I just discussed. So this brings us to the end of what exactly is a missile and how do we classify the missiles, what are the different types of missiles. Now, the second part of the discussion with respect to missiles is with respect to our country, India. That in India, what are the kinds of missiles do we have? What are the kinds of programs that we are running with respect to all the missiles in India? So let's move upon that.